Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Dwell podcast. This is the podcast that is dedicated to inspiring and activating church creatives, church leaders, everything in between. My name is Ryan Romeo.
Nathan Del Turco, excited to have you with us.
Yeah, we're really excited to be diving into today's podcast. This is something I really feel like in this season, coming out of 2020,
right?
There is so much need for what we're going to be talking about today. And we're talking about vulnerability in leadership.
Right.
Now, I think we've come out of this season, we were even just talking before we hit record. Well, I think we actually technically hit record. We're talking before this about Instagram accounts and, even things for me. I was thinking back on the release of the book and all these things.
Yeah.
And it feels so 2019 to me. It's like there was this, we were so worried about how can we create this like persona of strong leadership? How could we create this idea that, we're leaders that are always really strong? But I think 2020 forced us into this vulnerability where anybody who was acting strong, we knew they were faking it. And now I think we're left with like, okay, do we just go back as things are starting to loosen up a little bit? Do we just go back to what we were used to doing? And my answer would be no. I think vulnerability is so important. And for you and the things that you're doing, you're visiting other churches and all that. I'm sure that's stuff that you run into all the time.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it's interesting. That question, do we go back to it, I think is the question, right?
Yeah.
And there is a temptation to slip back into it because we naturally have a desire to get things back to, quote unquote normal.
Yeah.
But what kind of normal do we want?
Yeah.
Do we want maybe something new?
Yeah.
Which you and I were chatting a little bit earlier just about, this topic and kicking around and what does it mean to be okay with, I don't know, maybe not necessarily saying be okay with not being okay, but being okay with a bit of vulnerability or some weakness.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think for our team in particular, and for our church, our pastor at our church, David Stockton, he's been going in this season of talking about the weight of sin, repentance, these things that, again, they're not going to like get the applause line.
Yes.
But they're so important. And this last week, I think the thing that really impacted me, he's talking about heavy stuff. He's talking about sexual sin. He's talking about all these things. And he had this moment where he paused and he looked at the room and he said, hey, and this is not something, when I say sexual sin, every single one of us has a moment that we go, oh, like, I can think back on that.
Yeah.
And that was not good. That was not great. And he said, we all have some brokenness in this area. Mm-hmm. And I feel like as soon as he said that, it was not like hey, I'm telling you the 5 great ways to stop, sexual sin in your life. But it was this, hey, we're all in this thing together. That even as something really heavy like that normally is really hard to dive into, we're all in it together. And I think even for me, in looking at the past, I was looking at Outcry and things that I've done. I'm like, all really great, and a lot of leaders that I really love and I think are really awesome. But there is this temptation just in our society right now, this like social media society where it's like, we have to put forward this persona that we don't deal with anything, that we've got all the answers, that we've got the top 5 ways to get rid of these things.
Right.
Even as creatives, it's like top 5 ways to be more creative, which as somebody who went to art school and does a lot of creativity, some of that's like, okay, that's really helpful.
Yeah.
But creativity is this wild thing that sometimes it's like you could follow all 5 of those rules and it still won't work out for you, And it's this vulnerability of understanding, hey, we're all in this together.
Right.
And I think the American church is in the season of switching into that, like breaking that persona down.
No, I think that's 100% true. And I think to take it even a step further, I think what God is in the process of, well, actually, I'll go backwards even. I think that 2019, it was like this overarching year. Yeah. Overarching?
I say both. I don't really know. Arcing. Let's just say there,
of asking for revival. Mm-hmm. And Pastor Robert Ferguson from Hillsong Church, I remember when Hillsong said the revival's in the air, I remember he came out and he spoke and he said, do you know what you're asking for? And it was just such a sobering thought of like, you say you want revival, but do you realize that revival starts at the foot of the cross?
Yes.
Like if you really want revival, some stuff's going to break.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And, I mean, that's it. It's like it scales everything back to center.
Yeah,
so
totally.
What was I going to say before that though?
I don't know, but I do love that. I mean, the revival thing is huge because that was something I felt like too. It's like,
right.
You don't revive anything that didn't die first. You know, it's like, do you know, again, do you know what you're asking for? It's like, there is this death to self that has to happen before you get into that life.
Yes.
And I think that, again, in our Instagram culture, not to just only poke at Instagram, but in our social media culture, it's like, you have to always put forward this idea that it's only the revival. Like, I'm only getting to the good stuff.
Yeah.
And you never went through the bad stuff to get there.
Right.
And there's been leaders this year that have come out and you're like, oh, you were dealing with that behind the scenes and we had no idea, even though you looked really great on the outside, you know?
Well, and so now I remember when you just said that, it totally brought me all the way back full circle.
I just verbally vamped until you remembered.
It was great. So I feel like this year, 2020, has been a year of recalibrating. And I feel like God has and is pulling us back from this personality-driven ministry mindset, right?
Yeah, totally.
Because for the longest time, we as leaders have always looked to other leaders, which that there's nothing wrong with that in any way. But we've always looked to these other leaders that seemingly don't have any problems, don't have weakness, don't have struggle, don't have this. Yeah. And what it's created this almost... it's weird. It's almost like it's created its own Trojan horse for our spirit, where we've allowed the comparison and the desire for perfection to sneak in like a Trojan horse into our spirit. Yeah. And then it almost poisons us from the inside out because we know we're not perfect. Yeah. You know? Yeah, and it's almost like self-deprecating. You know what I mean? Like we're constant, totally. It's this internal battle. Yeah. And 2020 had a way of just kind of cracking all that open. Yeah. Be like, hey, surprise, no one's perfect, which we all inherently already knew, obviously, but for it to be so openly kind of exposed, everyone, you started to hear more leaders and more people stepping out about, hey, I'm having anxiety, I'm battling depression and all these things. Yeah. And it actually became, in a weird way, the most pure sense of revival you could ask for, because it was a true pulling back to center. Yeah. You know? Yeah, true pulling back to, maybe God isn't asking me to be like someone else. Maybe God's just wanting to make me the best version of me. Yes, right? Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. We talk about that all the time. Yeah. And we were talking before this about, even this morning I was reading in 2 Corinthians, in 2 Corinthians 10, somewhere in there. Yeah. And it's really funny because in that, the heading is Paul defends his ministry, which is just really funny. So the whole chapter's fairly defensive, and this is something I do love. Like, again, imagine like a really well-worded tweet. Like, exactly. Paul defends his ministry. Paul defends his ministry, yeah. And this is the thing, like, again, when we build this persona of like these perfect leaders, even biblical figures have these imperfections. So Paul's talking about his imperfection as a leader. He's going, a lot of you are saying, I'm super bold when I write you a letter, but then I'm very meek when I'm in person. So he's kind of going, yeah, I get it. Like, I'm real strong worded when I write you a letter, but then when I see you face to face, I'm a little bit more reserved. Paul's admitting that. He's going, yeah, I get it. I'm a little harder when I'm writing you something. But he has this whole section where he goes, but there's these people that are really trying to puff themselves up. They're trying to make a big name out of them for themselves and all this. And it starts with, and he says, they compare each other against one another. Right. So this comparison against other people that were there in Corinth. And he says their idea is flawed. Like, there's something very flawed at its very, very basic nature. And, you know, like Instagram didn't invent people being fake. I mean, you see, it's like it's just amplifying what was already there. I think it was Zanga. Was it Zanga? I think it was Zanga that did it. Oh, okay, okay, MySpace. Yes. Yeah, I thought it was MySpace. Yeah, Zanga. Yeah, deep cuts in social media. But it's been there. Yes. People's nature is to and this is where we need to like help each other be accountable. Right. But like, hey, are you trying too hard? Are you really not being, like you said,
the best version of you.
Yeah.
Which is ultimately what we're trying to do,
Right.
Not in a self-centered way, in a Christ-centered way, but in a way of going, I know what I'm strong at. And he said later on, you should be confident in this sphere. We say the sphere of influence.
Right.
He said like your sphere of gifting, like this idea of this is the area that God's given you.
This is your lane.
This is your lane.
Yeah.
And you can be super confident when you're in that lane.
Right.
But as long as you're not building it on this faulty idea of somebody else's life. And I think it's so easy for us to again, we just jump on and we go, oh man, I like Joel Houston. He's a great songwriter.
Yeah.
But then you can move into I think I'm going to be the next Joel Houston.
Right.
Like what a stupid idea that is, but we have those sort of ideas where we're like constantly trying to compare ourselves going, oh, maybe that's where I'm headed.
Yeah.
And God's like, no, you have this other lane that nobody else has lived.
Well, and it's completely contrary to gospel because God isn't saying, God doesn't need another Joel Houston. He doesn't need another Ryan Romeo, another Nathan Del Turco. He needs each and every person that he designed to be each and every person that he designed.
Yes. Yes.
And this, we were chatting a little bit about this, and you've heard this story before, but the 2019 going into pandemic, there was like a short stint of time where my family and we thought I had cancer actually. And it was a really heavy, really condensed time. It was 6 weeks. So from like beginning to finding out that I'm all clear and everything's good, but it was a 6-week span of just like complete and utter uncertainty. And I remember during that season, I didn't know how to process my emotions. I wasn't confiding really in anyone aside from my wife and my family. I didn't tell any friends that this was even happening. Yeah. And I remember it was almost like, do you remember those old like practical joke cans with like the peel back lid where like if you, it says peanuts on it and you open it and like,
snake.
Oh, I missed your mic. The snakes pop out, right? Yeah. I felt like there was a can of that sitting at the center of my emotions, like in my spirit, and the lid was on. And I remember one time my wife and I were driving over to a friend's house, and she was leaning into me, and she was being an encouragement and trying to just be the best wife that she could be in the moment. But she was leaning into me hard and just saying, why aren't you confiding this? Like, why aren't you processing it? And I told her, I said, I just feel like if I let that lid go, all my emotions will come out and I won't be able to get them back in if this turns out to be nothing. Yeah. What if it's nothing? And then I've just processed all this. Yeah. And we drove a couple more miles and we're driving up north. So we're going through the desert. And then she asked me, like, what are you so afraid of? Like, why are you being so resistant? Why won't you share this? And these words just welled up in my spirit and came out of my mouth before I could even stop them. I said, it makes me feel weak. And I broke down. I broke down so dramatically that my kids in the back of the car were like, is daddy okay? Like I'm weeping. And so I had to pull over because I can't even see. Yeah. But like that was the core of all of it because that is our fundamental desire. Like we want to be strong. And I, as a parent, I think most of my not wanting to be weak was for my kids, right? Yeah. And for my family, like I want to be invincible for my kids, Yeah. Yeah. But I would be lying if I said it wasn't my whatever it is, persona, my reputation, my whatever. Like there is that fundamental like desire to not appear weak. Yeah. And it's so prevalent. Yeah. In church creatives, in our leaders, in us as leaders, and especially, in the American church, it's like a pandemic in and of itself. Totally. This desire to look strong. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think for leaders, we tell ourselves, if we expose our weakness, right, those underneath us won't know what to do. Like, they're not going to know what to do with that. And you could tell yourself all kinds of lies, anything in that realm. Right. But at the end of the day, vulnerability actually releases something in people underneath you.
It does.
And I think obviously in an appropriate context, and you're not overdoing it, because there's a bit of, I feel like in the season too, it's like there's people that are overly doing that. Right. And I'm dealing with anxiety, and they're dealing with it nonstop 24/7. And we do say, hey, it's okay to not be okay. Right. So there is that sort of, how do I want to say it in culture? this idea that in some realms, it's okay to be vulnerable. It's okay. Right. It's starting to become a lot more okay to say, hey, I'm dealing with anxiety. Hey, I'm dealing with whatever.
Yeah.
There are still lines, though, that we in church leadership where moments where you go, hey, I'm having even a season where I'm having a crisis of faith. Mm-hmm. Every single church leader will hit that at some point. Every single leader, every single follower of Jesus will hit a point at some point where you go, gosh, you read a verse, you get hit with something happens in your life, gets you off kilter, and you go, you know what? I don't even know if I believe this anymore.
Wow.
We don't live in a culture where that's that's okay. Okay, or like let's figure this out. David and I were talking about this recently, and he was talking about it at staff meeting. He said everybody goes through seasons of deconstruction, seasons where you're going, here is my worldview and everything. And you start to go, well, is this good? Is this right? You know, maybe on a political level, great. You start pulling things out and go, oh, I don't believe what I used to believe about this anymore. But on a faith level too, deconstructing some pieces. And this is the kind of vulnerability I feel like the Lord is bringing into the church in this season. Not that we're a church that sits around and goes, oh, okay, it's, just keep doubting God, that's fine.
Yeah.
But no, we encourage each other, we challenge each other, but we also go, hey, you're not alone in feeling that. Help me, I'll help you walk through that a little bit, you know? And as leaders, we are missing out on a really big opportunity to help people underneath us grow when we're constantly putting on the mask of perfection.
Yes.
And that is actually not helping the people underneath us, because then they're going to raise the people underneath them with this idea of, I can never be vulnerable with them.
Right.
And I think that is something in the season that is so important after 2020 that I don't want us to lose. I feel like we're just scratching the surface of it. You know,
we are. And to go to the next level and to the next step of that, the whole reason it's okay to be weak is because it's okay to understand that God is strong.
Yes.
And to understand that without weakness, without vulnerability, there's no restoration, there's no transformation, there's no deliverance, there's no revival.
Yeah.
If there's nothing to revive and we've hidden it all under the rug, then revival shows up and goes, what do you need me for? Right? If revival was a person and they walk into your house, but you've just shoved all of your dirty stuff in your bedroom, and the revival shows up to your house and goes, I'm here to revive. Oh, wait, looks like you got it under control, right? But if we want true revival, we got to be vulnerable.
Yeah.
We were talking about the Chronicles of Narnia story. Yeah. And
that is so good.
So the recap is Chronicles of Narnia, Voyage of the Dawn Treader. Yeah. You got Eustace, who basically snuck into
Deep
Narnia.
Cuts, C.S. Lewis.
And so Eustace is this really obnoxious cousin. So for fans of Chronicles of Narnia, Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, this came a little bit later in the series in the Chronicles, right? So Eustace sneaks into Narnia basically with some of his cousins. He's this selfish, really obnoxious person, needs a revival. And they end up on this island. He wanders away. He finds this gold bracelet. He puts it on. He becomes a dragon. And he's a super miserable dragon. God starts to do a bit of work in him, or Aslan starts to do a bit of work in him. But then he gets to this point where he's done being a dragon. The bracelet at this point is cutting into his arm. He needs revival. He needs it to be gone. He needs to be a boy again. And Aslan, who represents God obviously in the story, leads Eustace to this pool, like this little pool. And Aslan says that you need to undress, which is the dragon scales, right? Because he's obviously not wearing clothes. So Eustace uses his claws and starts to scrape away the scales. And then he's supposed to get into the pool. So Eustace does this the first time, and he goes in and he scrapes it away, and he says it's painful, but bearable. And then he gets out of the pool and he looks down and he's still a dragon. And he repeats this several times. And he's just, at that point, he's just a mess. And he's just like, why isn't this working? To then Aslan's response to him goes, actually, you have to let me undress you. You have to let me do it. And Eustace, as the dragon, has to lay down, and Aslan, who's a lion, takes his claw and literally cuts the hide off of Eustace, cuts the dragon suit off of him, and then throws him in the pool, and he becomes a boy again, right? But how incredible, how amazing of a picture is that of revival, baptism, transformation? Eustace had to realize that it was okay to be weak in that moment and realize that he couldn't do it on his own. He could stand there and scrape the scales away by himself all day, throw himself in the pool, but it actually didn't bring any lasting change. It wasn't until he laid down like you would do if you went to go get surgery somewhere and you've submitted your trust to the surgeon, right?
Yeah.
And allowed God, or Aslan in the story, to actually do the work to transform you.
Yeah.
But it starts with acknowledging the weakness, right?
Yeah. And how many times do we
try to scrape it off on our own?
To scrape it off on our own.
Yeah.
And I think, and we were talking about this too, it's like I've had many seasons in my life where, and I just went through one recently, where the Lord will, like, there's things that I'm working on myself. I'm like, I know I got a problem here. I know I've got an issue here. I'm working on it. I'm doing the best I can. I'm listening to the stuff and doing everything that I can.
Yeah.
But then you get into that moment where you're like, I need surgery. I know I need surgery and I know it's going to hurt and I'm doing everything I can to like avoid it. And this was months ago, but I felt like there was this moment where the Lord was like, hey, like I woke up in the middle of the night and I was like thinking about it and I was going, okay. And the Lord's like, I'm about to do surgery on you and it's going to be really painful. And it's not really in your control. And I'm just letting you know before it happens.
Just giving you a heads up.
Just giving you a heads up. And I was like, oh. And what's so funny is, again, I think when you're tapped into the Holy Spirit, when you're tapped into the character of God,
right,
that is not a warning because he doesn't love me or like, hey, just let you know, coming from a calloused sort of place.
Yeah.
It was coming from a very loving place that I felt and I knew and I felt, I actually felt very trusting of the Lord going, great. Yeah. I've tried in my own power to do X, Y, and Z. Now you're going to come in and you're going to do this in your way. Right. And I think that's, I mean, 2020, how many of us, it was like, we're avoiding it. I was talking with the pastor yesterday. We're both Enneagram 3s. We're both like drivers, get things done kind of people. And we're like, wasn't 2020 so revealing? You know, like, yes, there's a healthy way. Enneagram 3s, there's nothing wrong with us. We're healthy. We're okay. We could drive in a good way. Yeah, we're both 3s. We could drive in a healthy way. It's okay. But there are moments where you start to realize there's this sort of idolatry that's been building in my life. And this like accomplishment idolatry that's building in my life. And I'm like kind of covering it up by my busyness, you know, like going, how are you doing? Oh, I'm so busy. As if like some people say that as like, oh, it's a bad thing. 3s can tend to say that as like, hey, I'm super busy because I'm really doing the stuff, you know? Right. 2020, somebody's like, how are you doing? I'm like, bored. I'm like, I'm sitting at home and I'm like, like calling people and I had moments where I'm just like on my computer trying to do work. It's lunchtime.
You're just creating.
Like I'm creating work for myself. And I really had a moment where the Lord was like, your kids are eating lunch in the other room and you're sitting on your laptop, like working so hard. Why are you doing that? You know? And this pastor I was talking to, he's like, I had the exact same thing. Like we were both like, yes, it was even the little moments of like, can we slow down and go have lunch with people? Can we, you know? Right. But I do think these seasons happen. Yeah. It's like Aslan tearing off the scales. It's like 2020 was a lot of that for us. And honestly, I think 2021 is a continuation of that story. Because we had things stripped away. Now they're coming back in. Right. And we're trying to figure out, what did we learn in 2020? And are we going to bury it with our busyness? Are we going to bury it with all the other things we use to self-medicate? Right. Or are we going to step into a new season of reliance on the Holy Spirit, reliance on the Lord? And that's going to require a collective vulnerability
and accountability.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow.
So I think that's that season that we're in. And we were also talking about, and yesterday I was doing a teaching on, what was I doing a teaching on? It was some sort of
with the internship crew.
Yeah, it was something about leadership, Jesus style leadership. Anyway, but I was reading through John 13.
Yeah.
And it's this very familiar story where you're like
servant leadership.
Servant leadership.
There it is.
Yeah, it's only the most common thing when you talk about Jesus style leadership, and I couldn't remember it. But we're talking about servant leadership, talking about John 13, which is this super familiar story where Jesus is washing the feet of his disciples. And And the more I started engaging into that story,
Yeah.
the more I started to realize this is a pretty miraculous story, and it's showing a vulnerability in Jesus's leadership that astounded me. And you think about it, it's like, okay, washing someone's feet. We've kind of heard that story many times.
Mm-hmm.
But in the context of looking at it the way the disciples would be looking at it, washing someone's feet was embarrassing.
Yes.
Like they've got their leader that they look up to. He's about to they think he's going to take over. He's going to free the Jews. Like they're going to be sitting at the right hand of Jesus. Like they're always bickering about who gets to, sit at the right and left hand of Jesus.
Right.
And you could sense for them, they're going, this is embarrassing. Like, don't do this.
Yeah.
And Peter, of course, is like the one vocalizing it always. Yeah. But Peter's like, no, you can't wash my feet. Because you can almost imagine they're going, we're going to be sitting at the right hand of this political leader. We're going to have all this power. It's going to be so awesome. And then now they're looking around going, I hope nobody sees Jesus doing this.
Yes.
Because this is embarrassing. And he's like, Peter's like, I won't even let you do it. No way, Mm-hmm. And before even in the setup, John says, Jesus, knowing his authority, that the Father had given him, and knowing that he would be soon returning to the Father, he went into this feet washing thing. It's like they're giving this little preface of hey, before you think less of Jesus because he's doing this,
he didn't forget.
He didn't forget his authority. And I started to think about it. I was like, man, this is like a moment of a leader taking initiative. Jesus is taking initiative. He is being vulnerable, extremely vulnerable with them. He's serving them in a way that's very eye-opening for them. Like it's shocking to them what he's doing. And as he's doing it, he still is retaining authority. And I thought, this is the most creative thing a leader could do. Like he's thinking outside of the box. He's thinking about his culture. He's going, what's embarrassing in our culture? What's like the lowest thing that I could possibly do? And he's like, I'll do that for them.
I'll do the most embarrassing.
I'll do that for them, And for us, I don't think we even fully appreciate how deep that was of a moment. But Jesus knew his authority.
Right.
He was confident. He knew who he was. But he was able to come at the disciples and say, this is the level of vulnerability. This is the level of lowering yourself in front of people and serving other people. I want you to do this for other people too.
Right.
And I think vulnerability is that for the type A leader that wants to hide all the stuff and wants to pretend that everything's okay.
Right.
We're missing out on some real golden opportunities to say, hey, here's a story of how the Lord met me in my weakness.
Right.
Here's a story of last week when I was really doubting Jesus.
Yes.
Then he came through. Like we don't get to hear those stories from the leader who's trying to feign this perfect persona all the time.
Right. Well, and it's interesting with that story as well, because the amount of humility that it took to do that.
Yes.
On the back end, because everything Jesus did, he was modeling, right? So he was saying, do this.
Yes.
Do what I'm doing.
Yes, exactly.
So if we can acknowledge, right? So like going through that track of mind, like if we can acknowledge our weakness, if we can understand that we don't have it all together, if we can allow Jesus to help us and transform us and to actually do the heavy lifting.
Yes.
Then what comes out of that, the Eustace as the new boy, what comes out of that, and even in the story reflects it, it reflects a spirit of humility and confidence, not in our own ability or our own strength, but our confidence in that when we're weak, he is strong.
Yes.
And it gives us a different type of humility, right?
Yes, absolutely.
It's not a false humility. It's not a guarded humility. It's not a fake humility. It's a true humility of going, I know who I am.
Yeah.
Like I am who he says I am.
Yes.
And
you only get there by going into the depths of
the only way to get there.
Crying till your kids are like, are you all right, Daddy? That's important, And even for the people I think that think they're being vulnerable, they're like, oh, I deal with anxiety. And, it's like, well, but are you actually dealing with depression? Or are you actually even getting to the point where you're feeling suicidal or something?
Right.
Those are lines that we don't cross. We're like, oh, I'm feeling anxious. And are you being vulnerable, but you're not actually getting to the heart of what's really hurting, you know? And that is something that in our culture, I see our culture moving that way.
Yeah.
And I see the church starting to move that way too.
Yes.
And starting to like not fighting this idea that being vulnerable is an okay thing to do, you know? And I think that as we're going into 2021, we have to admit, where are we at right now?
Right.
Like, where are you at? Where in your leadership, where are you right now feeling vulnerable? Where are you feeling brokenness? Those are areas that we have to dive into.
Yes.
And there are so many things that our leaders are, that we as leaders deal with, leaders underneath us are dealing with.
Yeah.
And we have to be able to create an environment where it's okay to pull it out.
Well, and an environment where it's okay to get help.
Yes.
Right? Because that is the ultimate next step, which is to do the hard work and to do the hard and heart work in all of it, right? And the only way to allow God to move into that it is to lay down on the table, on the operating table, and let God do the work. Because I think you alluded to it in the beginning when we first sat down and we were chatting just now, but sometimes in our culture, it just becomes this kind of like we just talk about our weakness, but there's no sense of deliverance. There's no sense of talking about our weakness.
It's okay to be not okay, but not okay forever. Like how long is that okay?
Right.
You know?
So it should be birthed in a desire to get better.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
At the end of the day, like we serve a God of deliverance. We have a God of promise. Like his word's full of promises for us of restoration. And granted, like we live on earth and it's a fallen world and all that stuff, all the things that we know. However, God's plans for us are still good. Yeah. You know? Yeah. And there's no shame in going and actually asking for help. Yes. And actually, so starting in acknowledging weakness and asking God to do the hard work and do the hard work. Now it's on us for it to have lasting impact, for us to remember what God said, which is his word, and also to go and actually do the thing that will get us heading in the right direction. Yeah. Right? Because getting help is actually showing that you have hope in Jesus. Yeah. Like if you don't get help, you're kind of admitting to yourself, even on a subconscious level, this is something that I'll always deal with. This is something that I'll always be operating in. Yeah. As soon as you bring it up to somebody else, you're actually opening yourself up for some surgery going, it's going to hurt, but I'm going to get better after this. You know? Yeah. It may be a long road. It may be a long road, or it may be a short road, but either way, the process of revival is forward. Yes. You know? Absolutely. So, and then we start to have these stories of victory that then you can go back and serve other people. And that's one of those things. I think we're in this very self-centered sort of environment. And I was listening to somebody talking about this with social media and all this stuff. Like you start to build this entire structure of your life around this idea that it's all about me all the time. And the antidote for that, it's very simple. It's obviously putting down your phone and stopping building this self-centered world. But it's serving other people. It's helping them when they're hurting. Right. Then you start to go, oh, I'm getting healing too. Yeah. Which is a very biblical idea that you start to get healing as soon as you're helping other people. Yeah. And that only happens when you have those stories of like, I've come through this hard time. Yes, I came through that season of doubt, and this is where I've landed. Right. And I could walk with you in it, you know? Yeah. The more you do that, the more your light starts to shine. The more you do that, the more your fire starts to burn hotter, because you're actually helping people doing what Jesus told you to do, because the things that he did, he wants us to do too. Right. You know? Yeah. Right. Absolutely. So we're getting long on time here. And so we want to kind of wrap up, and we have so much more. I feel like we could dive so much more. I had like 5 other thoughts that came to my mind, like, oh, we could dive into that. This is probably a subject I just feel like in our culture right now, there's this sort of prophetic feeling I'm feeling like where the Lord's saying, there's some junk that I'm working out in my church to get her ready for this next season. Right. And I don't even know if it's like, I don't know if it's short or if it's long. I don't know how long the season is, but I'm feeling like this season of, hey, open things up, expose the hidden things, so that you can be healed and so that you can move forward into this next season and walk in things you didn't think you could walk in, or those dark areas in your mind or in your thought process that have been holding you back. Though you think they're not, they are. When you expose them, God ushers you into this new season. Yes. And I just have that hopeful feeling for any of you that are watching, if you're leading,
leading something, just to be able to walk in that vulnerability, to be able to open up to people around you. Obviously find somebody that's trusted. You know, like you don't want to just say, hey, random person in the congregation, I'm just like opening up. Pray about it. The Holy Spirit will give you some insight. You could go after, I've gone in the past after professional people. That's like, okay, maybe I have to pay them to listen to me. That's totally fine. That's good. Wherever you need to go to create a safe space, to open that up, create that vulnerable moment, because ultimately that will create healing that you could then lead people underneath you when they are going through those same things. So we need to be those sort of leaders.
Yes, we do.
Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us on the Dwell podcast today. We got more episodes coming. We're cranking out a bunch of stuff. You know, it's going to be really, really awesome. Make sure and jump on Instagram, Facebook. We've got a great Facebook page that we were just talking about. We have our website too. Jump on the Dwell website. We have things that are coming with Dwell that are really exciting, and we're not quite ready to talk about them, but we're really excited about it. We really think that this podcast is kind of the tip of the spear for a lot of things that we want to see happening. Obviously in Phoenix where we're at, but throughout the nation, throughout the world, with creative leaders everywhere. Thank you so much for joining us. Until next time.
Thanks, guys.